Rural women have led the defence of the commons. From the European land enclosures to 21st century logging and mining in the global south, where they rely most on common forests, pastures, water, and so on. And where also women are the rural majority, yet less able than men or urban women to access market-based internet and mobile telephony services. So potentially, rural women may benefit most from community networks, CNs. CNs are shared, locally managed and operated telecommunications networks, and my TOCI article refers to a multi-sited ethnography about rural CNs. Rural women I've lived rurally in the South for most of the past 17 years and began helping to start CNs in 2008 in South Africa and continued when I moved to Namibia in 2014. So my analysis draws on my participation in CNs as well as data about other CNs. Supported by the Association for Progressive Communications, I studied CNs in rural India, Indonesia, Argentina, Uganda, Mexico, and South Africa, countries with varied economies and gender inequality. I also observed international advocacy for policies and regulations that are more supportive of CNs. Some CNs were set up by local inhabitants, some supported by non-profits and universities, and some involved government or commercial providers. Most provided internet access via Wi-Fi, but the CNs in Mexico provided GSM phone and SMS services. Rural women. Over 300 women and men participated in interviews, focus group discussions, observations, diary accounts, in activities planned by the CNs like workshops, and in my ad hoc encounters while I was waiting for transport under a tree, eating at a cantina, or doing morning exercises with women in a park. My interactions were simultaneously translated into English from local dialects, and participants were of diverse ages, education, employment, and income. Some were in host organisations that support the CNs. Some worked to maintain the CNs in some way. Others were users, and some were non-users who lived nearby. Rural women. Local governance of CNs was important to participants in all cases, who often explicitly related this to traditions about the commons. For instance, in Mexico, the CN is governed by a traditional Mixteco assembly that manages local resources and the communal tequio work, in which all households participate. Some people explained how their CN reinvented traditions. Bosco Uganda here cultivates an ethos of sharing skills and information amongst users modelled on traditions of talking around a fire, by arranging computers facing each other on tables near Wi-Fi access points. The Argentine CNs have facilitated connections between newcomers and people with local generational ties, groups that differed in how they related the CNs to political commitments or affordable internet. However, while rural CNs can support commoning, they can also act as enclosures to keep women out. Governance of the CNs was mostly undertaken by men, either by an assembly comprised of household heads or by executive decisions of a chief or a Grand Sabha. A Grand Sabha in an Indian village referred to how the CN mitigates social fragmentation. Yet only men could gather at access points. A young woman explained that she was lucky to be able to access the Wi-Fi because her home was within its signal, although this was only in the evening when she wasn't out gathering firewood in the forest or working on her agricultural land. Indeed, most CNs were not well situated in the social and environmental relations that are woven into women's everyday lives. Women spoke more often than men of the incompatibility of using CNs, and signing books, such as in Uganda, recorded that women used access points less often and for shorter durations than men. A mother in Mexico didn't have time to sit and use a local Wi-Fi to access social media, However, the CN provided GSM coverage, so it wasn't convenient. So it was convenient for women as they moved between their small businesses like her cantina, coffee plantations, and honeybees in the forest, and their voluntary techier work. In fact, women's voluntary labour is integral to the CNs. Maintaining CNs comprises many activities: coordinating equipment between people, carrying up mountains, charging phones, selling vouchers for access, preparing refreshments and doing childcare during meetings and installations. Rural women. In Indonesia, women volunteer for a dozen groups that deliver public services, such as monitoring pregnancy, feeding programs, preschool teaching. And they spend at least 3 hours a day, daily, preparing food for myself and the men who use and decide and oversee the CN. Women comprise under a quarter of all participants that worked on technological tasks, in villages or in support organisations. And since any of the paid roles in CNs were overwhelmingly for technological tasks, men were 3 times more likely than women to be paid. Exclusion from technological work isn't only about education. Women in the Argentine CNs, for instance, describe fitting such work around care labour. And in India, women, who comprise half of the engineers in a support organisation, avoided rural deployments. Prominent equipment like masts and solar panels are infrastructures for visibly performing certain masculinities. Participants in all cases spoke of local perspectives that women were not strong enough to climb towers, and of a machismo in the culture of telecoms. But my article is not simply about women's exclusion. Rather, it's about the uncommon relations produced at the intersection of market logics and gendered biases. The rural cases are cited in places that abound in many extractive relationships. Participants spoke of protesting mines and hydroelectric dams and cooperating to pursue fairer trade. Extraction extends to electromagnetic spectrum. Powerful companies control telecoms policy and monopolise spectrum. So CN activists fly around the world lobbying for access to spectrum on behalf of CNs. But gender blindness in their discussion reflects women's sparse representation in telecoms policy spaces and the distance of these discussions from the scales of rural women's lives. Thus, advocates overlook that short-range Wi-Fi signals are inaccessible to women and exclude the relations that women create in their routines. Advocates say CNs stimulate local enterprise, drawing on a prevalent technology paradigm that assumes market logics are inevitable. Yet historically, the market erodes the commons by reifying and undermining relationality. I thank everyone involved in this work.